Your Honour, again, I'm grateful for that time this morning where we had some issues to attend to. There is, as the Commission knows, one remaining witness, and I call the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, Pradeep Philip.
Mr. Philip, do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation, Your Honour.
Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this Royal Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, Mr. Philip. Take a seat, please.
So when you're ready, could you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Varghese Pradeep Philip.
And your current employment position?
Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services.
How long have you held that role for?
Since January 1 of this year.
You have, I think, been in the public service in senior positions for a long period of time, is that correct?
Correct.
Prior to holding the position of as the Secretary of the Department, where were you?
I was, prior to this role, I was Secretary of the Department of Health in Victoria since July 2012, and prior to that I was the Deputy Secretary of the Policy and Cabinet Group in the Department of Premier and Cabinet here in Victoria.
You have many roles and responsibilities as Secretary of the Department. I'll refer to the Department of Health and Human Services as simply the Department. And you set them out, or at least many of them, in one of your statements, which I'll come to. But among your responsibilities, you oversee the administration of youth justice, child protection, family violence and youth services in Victoria.
That is correct.
You have, under the Children, Youth and Families Act, all young people in detention are in fact under your legal custody. Is that right?
That is correct.
And so you've provided the Royal Commission with 3 statements. There's a statement of the 10th of August 2015, amended to the 26th of October 2015. A second statement of the 10th of October 2015.
August.
Thank you. Of the 10th of August 2015. And a third statement of the 27th of August 2015. Is the information contained within those statements true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
They are.
I tender those 3 statements, Your Honour.
30.46.
Mr Philip, before I commence asking you questions, was there something that you wanted to say to the Royal Commission?
Yes, I do. Commissioners and Council Assisting, if I may, to Norman Latham, to Joseph Barajetsevic, to BDB, Robert Cummings, BDC, BHE, Karen Hodkinson, BGD, Gabrielle Short, BDF and BDA. I want you to know that I have heard your stories. I have spent time in the gallery every day of this hearing and have watched many hours of evidence online. To BDD, William Clark and BHU, I will read your stories about your experiences in these state-run centres. Thank you to you all. Thank you for your bravery and for your stories. Before I address topics raised by the Royal Commission, I wish to acknowledge, on behalf of the State of Victoria, the abuse that children experienced in the institutions that are the subject of this hearing. Hearing the evidence that has been related to this Commission over the past fortnight, there is no one who would not be deeply shocked, saddened and appalled by the experiences that witnesses have lived through. These experiences are abhorrent and should never have occurred. As a father, I am shaken to the core that children and young people were forced to endure such horrific experiences. And Your Honour, I cannot shake from my mind seeing Mr Marijancevic pass to the Commissioners and General Counsel a photograph of himself and his three brothers and his comments. Your Honour, you have the narrative of an old man hurtling towards death. The human being that suffered was a child. And he goes on to say, pointing to the picture, that's the person that suffered. I'm the person that carried it, end quote. As a public servant, I am profoundly disappointed at the failures of our public institutions that led to or compounded the tragedies that have emerged through these hearings. I acknowledge that Turana, Winlaton and Baltara were institutions that were run and managed by the department. The department could and should have done more to protect children from the harm that they experienced as a result of unacceptable past practices and failings whilst under the care of the state. I offer my sincere and unreserved apology to all who have been affected by these failures and unacceptable practices. I acknowledge the devastating and ongoing effects that physical and sexual abuse has on children. I pay homage to the bravery of the survivors who have come forward to tell their stories to the Royal Commission and offer my deepest condolences to all who have been affected by these tragic events. The department must and will continue to strive for improvement in our practice. Survivors' accounts are critical to making sure that we learn from our past mistakes. It is a great service to the survivors who have given evidence have performed for our society, for those who suffer in silence, and for countless others whose suffering may be prevented by improvements that these accounts and this Royal Commission will undoubtedly spur. Thank you.
Sir, you have provided the Royal Commission with 3 statements that it should be understood are very detailed, correct? And that a lot of work has gone into preparation of these statements, not just by yourself but by others within the department. For the benefit in particular of those listening, I note that the first statement contains an overview of current systems, policies and procedures in youth justice.
Correct.
The second statement addresses past systems, policies and procedures in youth justice and out-of-home care.
Correct.
And the third statement focuses, for the most part, on important changes that have been introduced since the survivors of sexual abuse who've given evidence in this Royal Commission have had to suffer that abuse.
Correct.
You understand, of course, that those statements are tendered in evidence now and will form part of the Royal Commission's investigations, and I am not going to take you through chapter and verse all of those statements. I'm going to pick up on some key themes that have emerged from the survivors and ask you to comment on what the department has done already and what some of the ongoing issues are for keeping children safe from sexual and physical harm. You will understand from listening to the evidence that a number of former wards of the state give evidence that as children they were mixed in institutions with other children who had committed serious offences and who had, therefore, particular behavioural difficulties that impacted adversely on them. And an obvious example is BDA in very recent times in the late 1980s. And Grant Holland from Baltara, caseworker, gave evidence that children convicted of sex offending and much larger children were mixed with very vulnerable children. Do you say to the Royal Commission that that system has changed?
Yes, I do. In fact, that is the biggest change in the system, and it comes with a history. So it is the case that previously wards of the state for no fault of their own were in the same institutions as those who had committed more serious criminal acts. Today, our system is very different. Previously, all of these children were put inside what I could best describe as in a containment model. And we heard evidence from former staff and from witnesses of what that meant. The workers were described as screws. Others were described as authoritarian, as being old school. That punishment was the way misdemeanours or things were handled when things didn't go so well. in effect, criminogenic factors were really what drove the system. Today, that is not the case. Today, those who would be wards of the state are handled quite separately. What we have in our juvenile justice system are those that the courts have determined have broken the law and therefore require to be placed in an institution like our youth justice system. So they are not essentially people who, for no fault of their own, were deemed to be wards of the state.
The Royal Commission understands that since the late 1980s there has been a period of deinstitutionalisation, so that all the institutions that all three that were looked at in this Royal Commission have, of course, closed, with the latest closing in the early 1990s. There are, of course, dedicated custodial centres for children on remand and children who are sentenced, as you've mentioned. Do I understand it correctly that without going through our youth justice legislation, the principle is that children should never be detained in a youth justice facility unless that is a matter of last resort?
That is correct. In fact, I suspect something like 85% of children who are under some sort of juvenile justice order serve their time outside of these centres in the community.
In your statement of the 26th of August 2015, which had originally been the 10th of August, so the amended statement, from paragraph 18, you outline the youth custodial precincts. You note that there are two in Victoria.
Yes.
There's the Victorian Youth Justice Custodial Precinct.
In Parkville.
In Parkville, and that comprises two custodial centres and a remand facility.
That's right.
And as you set out in your statement, Parkville Youth Residential Centre houses young women who were aged between 10 and 20 at the time of their offending, and young men under the age of 15 in separate accommodation.
Yes.
The Melbourne Youth Justice Centre houses men aged 15 to 18 years, and the remand facility houses men aged 15 to 18.
Correct.
And you then go on to detail Malmesbury Youth Justice Precinct. That accommodates up to 90 sentenced young men who were between 18 to 20 years at their time of their offending. So Malmesbury, I'm sorry.
In addition to that, the Malmesbury Secure Youth Justice Centre will house up to 45 young men in medium to high security units.
So Malmesbury is for older male
yes.
offenders, correct? And for offenders who have been sentenced.
Yes.
At the request of the Royal Commission, you provided statistics relating to young people who are in custody. You note at paragraph 20 that, in fact, the data shows that Victoria has the lowest rate of children in youth justice detention in Australia. Are you able to tell the Royal Commission why that is?
Primarily because Victoria has adopted a position of, across the board, of trying to have more community-based services where kids can serve some of their time. Because the last thing we want to do is to take them out of community, to dislocate them even further from community, because at the end of the day, they're young. They've got their entire lives ahead of them, and it will be spent in the community. So the less time out of the community, the better. So it is only those who the courts have determined can't be, for their sake and for others, safely and securely looked after in the community, that they end up in our centres.
Just in terms of the statistics, you note paragraph 20, between the June quarter of 2010 and 2014, the number of young people in detention in Victoria on an average night decreased. So it was 172 in 2010, down to 150 in 2014.
Yes.
In relation to the profile of the children who are finding themselves in juvenile detention, you have provided a range of data for the Royal Commission from snapshots that are taken of young people in custody. 41% had previous child protection involvement.
Yes.
18% had a current child protection order. Those statistics show, don't they, that many of the children who are ending up in juvenile justice have come from backgrounds where child protection orders are required?
Yes.
You also quote a statistic of 60% who were victims of abuse, trauma and neglect. Can I suggest to you that anecdotal evidence would place that figure at a much greater, at much higher, somewhere in the line of 80 to 90%?
It may well be.
You note, for example, that 89% have a history of alcohol and or drug misuse. That is often linked, isn't it, to trauma that the children are experiencing?
Absolutely. It is also highly prevalent in family violence, as we also now know.
Do you know where that figure of 60% comes from? Is it formal recorded data?
It is from an annual snapshot survey that we do of all young people in our custody.
So the terms abuse, trauma or neglect might have a particular framework, but in actual fact might not be collecting the real picture.
Sure, that's entirely possible.
In your statement, you recognise that children who are in youth justice centres are particularly vulnerable to sexual and other abuse, correct?
Correct.
That's one of the things that's certainly highlighted by this Royal Commission.
Indeed.
But do you say that you understand that in spite of reforms that have been introduced in that institution, which we'll come to, those children are still at great risk of sexual abuse?
I think they come in with those risk factors and therefore, yes, they do remain at high risk. Particularly also given the age that they're at. This period of adolescence is a very difficult time.
You note in your statement a particular program for assessment and placement of those children. It's at paragraph 72 if you want to refer to it. But young people on admission to youth justice custodial centres now undergo an initial primary and mental health assessment by a registered psychiatric nurse.
Yes.
What's that designed to achieve?
So we try and provide a comprehensive health assessment. It's a right for every child that comes in, not an entitlement, not a luxury item. It is a right to have access to good health care. And when kids come into our centres, I think it is, in order to provide the right sort of care for them, it is incumbent on us to do a proper health and mental health assessment. These kids aren't here because things have been fine for them. They're here because things aren't so fine. So how we tailor our response in looking after them matters. So that's why this assessment is done.
Given the statistics on the number of children who have traumatic backgrounds, what are the models that are available for treatment of those children while they're in custody?
So it is varied. So there are some general things that occur in the centre. The first and foremost of which is some stability. There are some routines. Central to that is education. The kids in both our centres go to school. We have a school on site 7 days a week. One of them has more PE than the other days, but there is a routine of 7 days a week. There are a whole lot of programs around how they look after themselves, partly to teach some basic life skills. Then there are some specialist programs that, depending on the child's needs, that are provided, whether it be around sexualised behaviour or other matters.
So speaking of sexualised behaviour, in your statement from paragraph 133, you set out information about the treatment of young people who have been convicted of sexual offending and those with sexually abusive behaviours. A particular model known as MATS, funded by the department and delivered in custodial centres. Yes. Do you know when that program started to be rolled out?
I actually don't have that date, but I can find it for you.
All right. You're in a position to provide that to the Royal Commission. You tell the Royal Commission that MAP stands for the Male Adolescent Program for Positive Sexuality.
Yes.
It's funded by the department. Correct. And delivered by a particular rehabilitation team, correct?
Correct.
And just from paragraph 133, you set that out. That involves 17 registered psychologists and 1 social worker.
Yes.
And it's an intensive treatment for adolescent males who've been convicted of sexual offences. paragraph 136, particularly for the benefit of those who are listening who will be interested, you say it's based on an open group model.
Yes.
Would you like to explain a little more about that open group model?
It essentially is a group model where these things are discussed as opposed to generally a one-on-one program. It's very important to know that this is not for victims per se, it's on the other side.
And that's been developed based on the advice of psychologists who have...
Yes, it's a clinically based program.
All right. What about treatment for survivors of sexual abuse? So this is on the other side of the model.
Yes.
And it begins from paragraph 140. You set out that there are specific treatment programs, is that correct?
Correct.
So on admission, young people are screened for signs of physical injury, but also signs of sexual abuse?
Correct.
And then particular intervention is provided for those children, which involves support and counselling, correct?
Or clinically based models.
Does the department recognise that many of the young children who come in because they've been offending in some sort of sexual way will themselves be a victim? And that in fact what they're doing in their sexual offending is playing out behaviours that are being enacted on them?
Yes, and staff are trained to deal with this.
You mentioned earlier that the particular environment for a youth justice centre is a sensitive one because many of those children will be going through puberty, won't they, while they're there?
Yes.
And many of them will have particular hormonal issues that they'll need to try and understand.
Yes.
Has there been a greater awareness of those issues from the department in recent years?
Yes, there is, and that's why health is integral to this, and the way we view it as a right, as opposed to an entitlement, reflects that, I think.
Sexual activity between residents is prohibited, you set out in your statement.
Correct.
Nonetheless, and I'll come to specific statistics,
Definitely.
but it is an ongoing problem, isn't it, that staff have to have in place measures to protect residents from sexualised behaviour of other residents?
Absolutely.
Would you describe that as the biggest challenge for staff in keeping children safe from sex abuse?
Sexual and physical abuse, yes.
From paragraph 124 of your statement, you note that there are particular programs in place to minimise sexualised behaviour. And you outline a system where different behaviours are recognised as orange, red or black flag behaviours.
Correct.
That's from paragraph 126.
Correct.
Could you outline that program?
So given that we are highly attuned to this issue, it is something that all staff are trained to observe, and we act there are various trigger points. So an orange flag is where you might observe a behaviour that is of concern. So you might have a child using sexualised language. There might be drawings that they're doing. They might engage in the practice of dacking someone. Those things which you ordinarily might think is child's play, in this environment is not. It is flagged as an issue of concern. And what that triggers is an individualised behaviour management plan. And so some work is done to keep close monitoring of this child and try and work on some of his behaviour. So staff are trained to be positive role models, and so they will start to talk to these children about that sort of behaviour early, rather than it become something major. And so it's a precursor to something that's major. Second is where behaviours are abusive and potentially illegal, so explicit sex talk with younger children, touching the genitals of others, being degrading, triggers in our system a red flag, and much more work is done with the child. And finally, where there are behaviours that we would deem to be illegal, forced sexual contact, harassment, voyeurism, we would call that a black flag, and it would trigger a serious incident report. The red flag would trigger an incident report. The black flag would trigger a serious incident report. The orange flag would start us on an individualised behaviour management plan.
Mr. Phillip, in response to the Royal Commission notice to produce, the Department has provided data of all reports of incidents of child sex abuse in juvenile justice institutions from January 2005 to June 2015, which is the time when the Royal Commission requested that. You set out the data from paragraph 147. The data provided by the Department showed that there had been 121 incidents reported within youth justice custodial settings that appeared to be instances of sexual abuse. That demonstrates, doesn't it? That's over a 10-year period, but it certainly demonstrates the ongoing need for vigilance in this area.
Absolutely.
This is not just a historical problem, is it?
It's not. This year alone, we've had 2 category 1s in 2015. So the fact that you have any is of concern, but this is a highly charged environment with a cohort where this is a real issue.
Okay. And you use the term category 1, so I'll just ask you to explain it. There are in fact 4 categories. Is that correct? I'm reading from paragraph 150. There's category 1, 2 and 3 incidents and significant and event case notes, which is category 4. Category 1 incidents include reports of sexual abuse. Is that correct?
Correct. If I could just clarify, we have made a change in the system in the last few years. So we have category 1 reports where things like sexual assault, client to client, staff to client are all reported. The second is category 2, where there are events that threaten the health, safety and well-being of young people or staff. And then we no longer have a category 3. We have for everything else a significant events case note.
You break down these statistics and people might be interested to hear them.
Certainly.
Of that 121 that reported over the 10-year period stopping in June 2015, 16 were category 1s?
Correct. And 2 in 2015.
2 in 2015. So 2 since June 2015?
Since the beginning of the year.
Okay. And over that 10-year period, there were 29 category 2s?
Correct.
And the remainder were category 3s, or what were then called category 3s and significant events?
Correct.
In terms of the parties involved in those 121 incidents over the decade, 48 involved client to client?
Yes.
5 involved staff?
Yes.
3 involved someone else abusing the client?
That's right.
Would that be somebody coming in on leave?
That's right. Possibly, yes.
And there were 65 unknowns. Where do those unknowns come from?
So these incidents are where the parties involved were not noted on the initial incident report. In order to, it doesn't mean that we don't necessarily know who they are, but it would require a reading of the individual file to determine.
Does that suggest, you agree that it's important to actually know who these people are who are involved. Has there been any move to improve the reporting of those so that in the future you'll be able to?
Yes, there is. And we also have a system now where every category 1 and category 2 report is audited on a quarterly basis by one of the branches in our North Division. So their job is to, every quarter, do an audit of every category 1 and category 2 report. In addition to that, these are discussed in meetings with the head of that branch and also the Director of Secure Services at their fortnightly meetings with the Deputy Secretary of the North Division. So one of the things we are trying to do is put this on the agenda on as many occasions as we can so that we can drill down into what's happened, why is it, what have been the triggers, what has been the response, importantly, how are the kids going, and have we dealt appropriately with those who've perpetrated the assault.
How long has that system been in place for?
For a couple of years, but the frequency of those discussions is increasing. So we are trying to find more and more ways to have these discussions to drill down further.
In terms of before I move off the statistics, in terms of the breakdown according to the type of behaviour of these 121 incidents over the decade, 80 of them involved sexual behaviour.
Yes.
2 of them involved what was described as sexual exploitation.
Yes.
20 was sexual assault, client to client.
Yes.
And there were 2 incidents of reported assault by staff members, sexual assaults by staff members on clients.
Yes.
I'll come shortly to what happens to staff who where an allegation is made about a sexual abuse. Before I do, though, you mentioned there a system whereby there's room for outsiders from the correction services to review what's happening with the incidents?
Yes.
Who are the outsiders who are brought in?
So within the department, we have allocated responsibility for our secure services to sit under one of our deputy secretaries who runs the North Division. She has ensured that one of her branches, the Client Outcomes and Service Improvement Branch, has the function of every quarter auditing all the Category 1s and Category 2s. In addition, all of these reports flow into our department performance management system, which we have a thorough discussion about every 6 months. And so it is also subject to scrutiny by the department's most senior executive, the Executive Board, twice a year as well.
You heard evidence in this Royal Commission of serious failures by staff members to act on reports of sexual abuse when they were made. So, to remind you of some examples which I'm sure will be in your mind, BGD, when she was at Winlaton, reported to numerous staff members, so that we know of at least 5 staff members who were aware of what was happening, some within Winlaton and some in the department, and nobody did anything to protect her from ongoing sexual abuse by her father. BDA at Baltara in the 1980s, late 1980s, reported the abuse, and that was never reported on to police, so that nothing was done to protect him from ongoing sexual abuse. And Grant Holland, the caseworker, who told the Royal Commission that he became aware of many instances of sexual abuse at Baltara that were not properly investigated, that were minimised by staff, and where no action has taken. What has changed in respect to firstly, the culture of the department, if anything?
Sure. And can I say, you've touched on probably what is the most important factor, I think, in turning this around. You can have all the rules and regulations in place, and you do need to be vigilant about those, but unless people do the right thing, the system does break down. And so values and culture are really, really important part of our organisation now. And there is a lot for us to do in that, and we will be doing a lot more. From that flows a whole range of things that I think start to change the system. If you think about a child and what are the avenues for them to make complaints, to raise this, we now have a broader group of people, not just the custodial officers, who they have access to. For example, they do have the youth justice worker within the centre. We now have professional health workers who see them on a regular basis as another access point. We have community workers who are part of their care team who they might have access to. Given the link with child protection, we have the child protection worker part of the team who they may have access to. The Commissioner for Children and Young People has an independent visitors program. They come monthly and talk to the children. And so that is another avenue. They also have a unrecorded phone line directly to the Ombudsman. And that is available to any child. So one of the things we're trying to do is widen the access points for children to be able to raise something. What does that do? It minimises the probability of staff being in cahoots with each other about this. So that's one. Second, there are much better monitoring systems. So we have the ability on our centre now with CCTVs in place to monitor all common areas. And they are on 24 hours a day. So bedrooms know that we have 2 special bedrooms in each area where we do have cameras, but only under certain authorisation. But all other common areas where things are likely to occur, we now have CCTV cameras, which have both vision and audio. So staff can be under no illusion that if something is reported, there is a very good chance. So the only other place for staff to engage in this are things like bedrooms. Now, bedrooms are very, very special places. There is no reason for a staff member to generally go into a bedroom alone. Usually there'd be 2 people. And at night, when things are in lockdown, we have new systems in place that, for instance, if a door is open after doors are shut, it is automatically logged and recorded. The place, the door, the time that it has been opened. Because we have these 2 magnetic strips, they're called reed switches. As soon as the door is open, they trigger a log. So it is impossible for a staff member at night to enter a room without it being logged. And of course, because they'll be entering from a common area, there's CCTV footage. So there are some things now already in place that are dealing with that. And third, we are doing a lot of work with our staff about what their roles and responsibilities are, and fundamentally, that even though this is a corrections facility, that we apply, what we are trying to do more and more is bring a trauma-informed approach. To give you an example, as was provided to me when I went out recently, a child may arc up about going to bed. They may say, no, I'm not going to bed. A traditional response would be, Johnny, you are going to bed. Right? And what does Johnny do? He reacts and says, uses colourful language, right, to the person. What would then be a normal reaction? Well, I'll teach you a lesson, I'll drag you in. What we're trying to do is to educate staff, and that is, hey, there may be a reason why Johnny is arcing up about going to bed at night. There may be something in his background that says, going to the bedroom at night is not a safe place. It's a difficult thing. So we're training staff to say, well, maybe take them to a timeout area, common area, and just sit down for a few minutes and talk them through it. De-escalate the issue. And then Johnny may be willing to go to the bedroom.
You set out in your statement, I'm not going to take you through it in detail, a different type of supervision at night. So do you say that in your detention facilities there is appropriate supervision, staff numbers for supervision at night?
I think it is appropriate at the moment, yes.
And that there are knock-up buttons, as they call them in the adult facilities? Are there electronic facilities for children to raise the alarm at night from their
Every bedroom has a call button, and it is checked, if I remember correctly, every day.
And you set that out in some detail in your statement. I just want to bring us back to one particular case example. You will understand the example given to the Royal Commission by Karen Hodkinson,
yes,
of a situation where she was a child and was abused by a social worker. She disclosed that to somebody, a staff member called Florence Baxter, and she was struck across the face, called a lying little bitch, and got no assistance. What do you think about the possibility of that happening in your juvenile detention centres today?
First, can I say I'm horrified in any time, in any place, that a reaction like that would occur to a serious report. I think we have minimised considerably the chance of that happening, primarily through the staff we recruit, the psychometric testing that we now have introduced into all our recruitment, but also for instance, we have in every unit, there is a staff meeting every day. And we use that opportunity not only for handover, but also to reinforce some of the messages that we think are important about the values of the place, about the code of conduct. If there are any changes to the rules and practices, they're reinforced there. And also, it is a chance for staff to talk about the kids who are there. So anything that brings us back to realising that the person in front of you isn't just any person coming off the streets. They're kids who are there because they've suffered an enormous amount of trauma, and we've got to understand that and react accordingly.
There are two other cultural issues that I wanted to raise with you in this context. One is that Mr. Holland told us about a culture where some staff were terrific and really cared about the kids, and they were too scared to speak out, or they were in fact disciplined if they spoke out outside the chain of hierarchy. Do you think that culture may still exist?
I would hope not, and I suspect not, because of all the things we've been doing. I did do a little bit of a check, and I think we have 90% of our staff, around 90% of our staff, have been there less than 15 years. So one of the things is there is a cultural change that is underway. A few years ago, less than 30% of the staff would have been female. It's now almost 50. So a few things are going on. The sort of things we expect staff to do, excuse me, a few things that we expect staff to do in terms of codes of conduct and the values of the place, understanding what they're here to do. Second, the process we put them through to get employed. So in the past, we heard examples of friends of friends being employed in an ad hoc process. They're upfront, they're public processes for recruitment, which include psychometric testing. So we are trying very hard, and we're pursuing a policy of greater diversity. So all of these things in combination are the things we're trying to do. Excuse me.
The second cultural issue is that you will have heard a very frequent theme, which is that there was a culture within those institutions of being punished for dobbing or lagging. It appears from Mr. Holland, but that culture pervaded within staff, but certainly within the children. Do you recognise that as a problem in terms of children reporting the abuse in the first place?
Look, it must. It must always be an issue. I think in any situation that kids find themselves in, they've always got to cross that adult barrier, that authoritarian barrier, in any setting. But in here, probably even more so. So we recognise that.
One of the ways in which that might be broken down is education. In your statement, you set out the Parkville College education programs,
yes,
and that includes sex education, is that correct?
Yes, it does.
Is any of that sex education focused around the right that children have to speak out about abuse?
I can't be absolutely sure, but I feel fairly certain it does.
Are you able to take that question on notice and get back to us about that?
Can you add to that? Just letting us know whether that education includes the impact of abuse?
Sure, I can confirm that for you.
So, paragraph 119 of your statement, you inform the Royal Commission of the legislation that we heard a little about yesterday. That is a new criminal offence in Victoria for failing to protect a child under the age of 16 from the risk of sexual abuse that commenced operation on the 1st of July 2015.
Yes.
Would that legislation apply to staff in your detention facilities?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I can give you the example then of assuming a complaint along the line of Karen Hodkinson. If it was later revealed that a child who made a complaint of that nature was slapped across the face and no efforts were made to protect her, that person, that staff member, would be committing a criminal offence, wouldn't they?
Correct.
And for those who were supposed to look after BGD, assuming she was under the age of 16 at the time that complaint was made, a number of people, social workers, youth workers, deputy superintendents, would be committing the offence if they didn't act to protect her, correct?
Correct. Not only under that provision, but also failure to disclose, because we did hear evidence from BGD that she had already informed them of prior abuse. So failure to disclose and, for the case in these centres, failure to protect, yes.
Is there any training that you have planned or thought about to inform your staff of those provisions and remind them of those responsibilities?
Yes, I understand that already in place.
You mentioned that the Ombudsman has a particular role in terms of keeping children safe from sexual abuse. Ombudsman visits juvenile detention centres?
Yes, they can. Their main, the main way in which the Ombudsman work is to run on-motion inquiries.
And they provide a visit, or there's a external visitors program, correct?
Yes, run by the Commissioner for Children and Young People. It's an independent visitors program. Every month.
As a result of the Ombudsman's oversight facility, it's the case, isn't it, that in 2010 he identified a number of problems within the juvenile justice facilities?
Correct.
I'm reading from a report called Victorian Ombudsman Recommendations, third report on their implementation, February 2014. You're familiar with this report?
I know of its existence, yes.
And you're familiar with the 2010 report
yes.
that raised certain concerns. This report this recommendations report refers back to some key issues in the original report when the Ombudsman identified a number of factors within the Melbourne Youth Justice Centre and Melbourne Youth Residential Centre, which he refers to as the precinct. It followed a disclosure under the Whistleblowers Protection Act that staff at those facilities had, and I'm quoting, incited assaults between detainees, assaulted detainees, used unnecessary force when restraining detainees, supplied contraband to detainees, and stolen goods and consumables. This Royal Commission doesn't review the entirety of the youth justice, but it certainly suggests that there are ongoing issues between staff and children that have to be reviewed.
So that was a reference to what happened that sparked the 2010
yes.
inquiry, and if memory serves me correct, you will see a spike in the number of people who left employment with our service shortly after that.
So one of the responses was to do a review of staff and get rid of those staff who were not appropriate.
Indeed.
The Ombudsman investigation identified some systemic failures, which included dirty and unhygienic conditions, overcrowding and lack of adequate facilities. That meant that some detainees were placed on mattresses on the floor in isolation rooms, having to use a bucket as a toilet, and a failure to ensure that all staff had working with children checks. Do you recognise that those issues that were identified by the Ombudsman around 2010 are issues that impact on the ability to keep children safe from sexual abuse?
Absolutely, and also it goes to the dignity of the human being. I mean, to be placed in those conditions is not right. And since 2010, as a result of 2010, there's been significant investment in the facilities, dealing not only with the Ombudsman's report, but in 2010 there was another very major report following the escape of 6 young people, and it was the Neil Comrie report. And both those reports resulted in some significant changes both to facilities, but also practice, as I've also mentioned in terms of staff and in our employ, and that continues. For staff who engage in those sort of activities, who want to break the rules, they do not have a place in our service.
I appreciate that you were the Secretary of the Department of that time, but again it underscores the fact that these are not ancient historical problems that are no longer an issue.
No.
Sorry, could I just ask this question, Mr. Philip? Given that report is really contemporary, 2010, what do you think the culture of the department was at that time that allowed those practices to continue? In this inquiry, we've heard of practices in the 60s, 70s and 80s. Here's a contemporary report, notwithstanding the fact that there have been improvements. What do you think, or what have you been able to ascertain in relation to the culture of the department that allowed that to occur as recently as 5 years ago?
Commissioner, I think a couple of points I would make. One is, I think the whole system's been evolving essentially from a containment model to a therapeutic model. And that, by definition, striving for a therapeutic model means we have to keep learning, and it has to be contextualised with the understanding of that, the child in front of us, the person. As we've been evolving, it was only in 1992 that we shut these facilities down. And so there is, I suspect, there's been a lag in the system of people who've worked in a different environment still exiting, still being encouraged to exit. Second is that our practice has changed dramatically. So the practice of introducing a trauma-informed approach within a corrections setting is relatively new. And I think that is probably going to have the biggest impact on the type of person we employ and what they do and how they interact with children. Changing culture is difficult. It doesn't happen overnight, but unless we make that a significant focus, it won't change. A lick of paint, a new facility is nice in its own right, but doesn't change the model of care. And that, I think, is what we've been trying to do over recent years, is change the model of care.
Can I just ask this? When Dr. Eileen Slack was appointed, her terms of appointment included words to the effect that the institution and her responsibility was to provide care and rehabilitation to girls within Baltara, going back some decades. It wasn't about containment per se. Nevertheless, the practice seems to be, based on what you've just indicated, one of containment. Why was there such a disconnect between the principles of stated and the actual practice for decades? Because the notions of care and rehabilitation appear to have been the stated principles of the department back in the era that we're looking at those matters.
It is a very good point you make, Commissioner, because it is the case that this principle about care has been there for a very long time. But our understanding of what that means, I suspect, is what's changed. One of the seminal reports in this area was the Carney Review in '84. And Carney, more than others, very clearly starts to create this distinction between adults and children. And says, actually, they're very different. Starts to put in place a difference between needs and deeds. Creates a sense of proportionality, along with Justice Fogarty, starts to change our thinking about practice in a significant way. So the principle about care has been there for a very long time, but it's our understanding of what care means and the practice that goes with it that I suspect is what we're focused on and changing. And it can give rise to quite interesting situation. So if we look at the 70s and the institutions like Turana, even the architecture, while there's no word containment, the architecture screams containment. For instance, where the staff pod used to be, in one of the buildings, it faced an area where children might play table tennis or something, and the dining hall. Where were the dormitories? Out the back, out the side, out of sight from staff who would be there on night duty, for instance. And those dormitories in the architecture were rooms where you'd have 10, 12 children. If you walked into the room, out the back, around the side, was the bathroom, so hidden from view. So the architecture kind of screams containment, even though the principle of care is there. So things are changing in that sense now. So in our facilities, in terms of architecture, we now have individualised bedrooms with en-suites, with all those strict rules about staff going in and out, particularly at night. Staff sit in an area where they can observe down all the corridors. So I think there's some of the changes that reflect our better understanding of what care means.
I need to correct the record. I think Dr. Slack was with Winlaton, not Baltara. Right. Sorry about that.
Before you proceed, you have spoken of a therapeutic model and of trauma-informed care. Both therapy and trauma-informed care are long-term in nature, and yet your custody of children is short and medium-term. How do you reconcile those two objectives?
That is a major problem we face. You're absolutely right. Therapeutic and trauma-informed engaging in dealing with behaviour is long-term, medium to long-term. Our hope is that children minimise their time with us. So increasingly what we're trying to do is to see how we build these links for when they leave. So it used to be the case that children would just leave and that would be it. But now we are trying with pre-release programs, with a re-engagement of the community, trying to connect them up with services that may in some way continue. But I have to say, Commissioner, this is an area that needs a lot more work into the future, because kids come in, we only hope for a short period of time, but the flip side of that is the continuity of this sort of care is minimised. It's one of the conundrums that we face. The answer, I suspect, lies in the better and more seamless integration of the service we provide in terms of therapeutic care and trauma-informed back out in the community when they leave.
Sir, I just make the point in short form that in your statement you set out certain key standards for staff, and you do that from paragraph 54. Some staff obviously are going to be more competent than others and more well suited to working with children than others. Do you say that there have been significant efforts to train staff following a process of weeding out staff who are wholly unsuitable?
Yes, all new staff start with a 4-week induction program where they learn about boundaries, about sexualised behaviour, key modules, about de-escalation, how to better understand the staff and also the children, and also how to better integrate with the various programs that exist. To give you an example, we now have a lot of the staff engaging with the students around the education program. In the past, it would be the case, teacher educates, custodial staff stand at the door. It no longer is the case. They often sit down together and actually help on the education front. So there are steps that we've taken in terms of induction. The other thing we do is we offer all staff, new staff, but also all staff, and we provide support for them to undertake a diploma in secure services. That is encouraged and supported. We've already had people graduate, and we are finding an increasing number of existing staff who are taking that up. I think that's really important because it provides a qualifications regime to our staff sitting alongside practice. And it is one thing we encourage greatly.
You note in one of the issues, as you'll be aware, that's come up in this Royal Commission is that many children were subject to very intrusive searches when they returned from leave, which included cavity searches.
Yes.
You make it clear in your statement that cavity searching is not permitted in any of your facilities.
Correct.
When children enter the facility, there will be some occasions when searches are required to make sure you keep them and staff safe.
When they come in each time, there is a search.
There are particular protocols in place in relation to searching now.
Correct.
Has to be 2 staff members present at all time, for example.
Correct.
And needs to be a member of the same sex conducting the searches.
Correct.
And you set out further safeguards in your statement. In relation to an issue of leave from a facility, we know from BGD that she was allowed home in circumstances where she was then sexually abused by her father, who was known to be a predator, without sufficient checks being done. What children in Parkville and in out-of-home care will be going back to their own homes on occasions, correct? Is there a practice of risk assessment for those children now?
Yes, it is. It is quite a formal and systematic process for us to conduct a risk assessment plan for 2 reasons. One is where they might go, but also where they're at in terms of their own development within the institution. but we are very clear about the risks around where they're going. We form links with a community worker to ensure that there is at least some knowledge of. So, for instance, as you've pointed out, there's a high proportion of our kids in our facilities who've come from child protection, so we link back with child protection, who will have a better understanding of the home situation, and that informs the risk assessment. In addition, we have 4 different levels of risk. We have different levels of sign-off, but the first time any one of our kids goes on leave, the director signs off.
To allow a child back into a home where a predator who had sexually abused them has access is an appalling failure to protect a child from sexual abuse, isn't it?
Correct.
And it was in the 1970s, just as it is now.
Correct.
Before I move on from the issue of detention facilities, you will have heard evidence of the use of Depo-Provera at Winlaton.
Correct.
In circumstances where that drug was not approved for
Correct.
general use in the community, and in circumstances where consent had not always been obtained from the child. There will be a need for some children in detention to receive medication. How is consent dealt with now?
So earlier you pointed to the health assessment that gets done on arrival. That also deals with medications to ensure that we have proper care, etc. On the particular issue you raise, consent is as it is done now in the more general community. Children and medical practitioners sit together, and there's a medical practitioner's assessment about whether the child is capable of giving consent that matters. This has been a very, very delicate and sensitive topic in the community, but it is right to apply those same standards for the kids coming in here. So where the child provides consent with the medical practitioner in a clinical setting, that's when consent is obtained and is respected.
So some children who are in the care of the state will nevertheless be capable of consenting to their own medication needs.
Will be capable, yes.
Yes.
Yes, and they will be the ones who make consent.
Finally, on this issue of detention centres, noting the other material in your statement, you outline a process for exit interviews for all children who leave detention centres, correct?
Correct.
And what are they designed to achieve?
So this is a system that we introduced in 2012. It is run by the Independent Visitors Program under the auspices of the Commissioner for Children and Young People. It essentially tries to look at what are the kids' views about whether they've been safe, whether they've been treated with respect, what are the programs like. I think in the modern world, where in every other setting we are seeing the rise of the consumer, the client, the person, their experience matters. And if we don't capture that and take it seriously, then I think we become relics. So what we're finding, it's only been going for a couple of years, things that come up consistently are things like food. That is always an issue. Not what we would have thought as in always bad food, but sometimes, quite often, do I really need to have these vegetables on this plate? And on one of my trips, I recall one of the kids making a comment to the director about why hadn't he thought about introducing McDonald's into the place. So they're the sort of things that we survey,
Are you picking up any themes of children reporting abuse?
in that survey, no.
Is there an opportunity for children to report abuse in that survey?
Through the independent visitors, yes.
Okay. And with the exit interview, is there a particular form that children fill out?
There is a template.
There's a complaint form?
A template.
A template, I'm sorry. And would you be in a position to provide that to the Royal Commission at some stage?
Certainly.
Ms. Dwyer, you're about to change topics.
I am, Your
now,
Honour.
are you? I'll just have a couple of questions before we leave this of Mr. Phillip, and they relate to the paragraphs in your statement, Mr. Phillip, about the reported incidents.
Yes.
So I'm looking really from paragraphs 147 on in your amended statement of the 26th of August. So with respect to those reported incidents, where do those numbers go outside the department? Or do they?
I think we do report overall incidents in our annual report. I can come back with a clarification on that, Commissioner. I should know the answer to that. But they certainly get reported all the way through our system and get audited by people outside of that particular service.
Outside the service, but my question is
the department.
Outside the department. So, for example, in an annual report.
And I will confirm that for you.
And in such a way that it's clear on the public record about those numbers, those categories, and that breakdown.
Yes, I'll confirm that for you. The other point is a number of the things that come up on our system in terms of incidents will often have come through the Ombudsman, because it might have been reported directly to the Ombudsman by a child.
Yes, but that of course is a reactive intervention, isn't it? The intervention of the Ombudsman.
Correct.
As opposed to a supervision or monitoring model that requires your department to actually make public the complaints and incidents that are being produced inside its own system.
Correct.
And staying on that topic, the next issue I wanted to raise with you, your own background confirms that you would be familiar with the notion of the root cause analysis.
Absolutely.
That's done inside the medical model.
Yes.
Is there that sort of analysis that's being applied to these serious major incidents?
Perhaps not systematically, and in fact one of the things we have just done is undertake a quality and safety governance review, and we're introducing a new clinically based governance model which will have the senior practitioner in the department oversee, and is essentially to try and bring what is common in the health field into this. So the way we'll scrutinise the numbers and the care will essentially be what we've been doing in the health sector for a while.
Can I just ask a couple of follow-up questions relating to the same paragraphs? Can I just understand a couple of things that are referred to in paragraphs 154, 5 and 6? Are they substantiated incidents?
By that, do you mean they've all been...
Are they just reports per se, or are they reports that have been investigated and the incidents referred to, for example, in 156 have been confirmed?
All those reports will be investigated.
But the numbers?
They will be categorised correctly. So
sorry,
they will be investigated and...
Sorry, I'll be clearer. When we look at 156, are those numbers there of confirmed or substantiated incidents? So when you say, for example, sexual assault client to client, 20, are they 20 reports or are they 20 substantiated reports?
I think they'll be 20 reports correctly categorised.
Not necessarily substantiated.
That's right.
So of the categories B, C, D, E, F, just using the terminology you've used, all of those are criminal activities?
Correct.
Would you be able to advise whether of the 28, how many of those were in fact reported to the police, if any?
I would expect all of them would have been reported to the police, but I can confirm that for you.
And if that's the case, I was just going to ask, if you knew that, what were the outcomes? In other words, if the 28 were reported to the police, how many actually led to some charge being...
And I could find that out for you, because they'd be recorded, they'd be dealt with in a very different system, but I can certainly endeavour to find that for you, Commissioner.
And I'm assuming in A, and I'm not familiar with the law in Victoria, behaviour sexual may or may not be a criminal activity. They may contain actions that are not criminal in nature. Is that correct?
That's right. That would be correct.
Thank you. I have a further follow-up question, Mr. Phillip. In responses both to Councillor Sisting and to Justice Coate, you remarked on the reports children can make directly to the Ombudsman.
Yes.
You may or may not be aware that commissioners in this Royal Commission have direct contact with many thousands of survivors of child sexual abuse. And one of the very common reports they have is that as children they had no safe place to report. I wonder if you could just amplify your earlier answers and tell us whether that service that's now available of reporting to the Ombudsman is used, whether it's used frequently, in other words, numbers are recorded, and what happens to those reports that are made.
Certainly. I can confirm it is used, and it's used reasonably frequently for a whole range of things, from very minor things to very serious things. The Ombudsman's Office take them all very seriously. They ask us for a lot of data, and again, for a number of these things, we can verify a lot of things with the Ombudsman's Office because of the CCTV footage, because there's a child will report a time, a place, whatever the incident was, and we'll be able to review that. And it is every one of those times that the Ombudsman requests something of us, which is nearly 100% of the time, it will be logged on our critical incident reporting system, and the process of investigation will go through and we'll reconcile back with the Ombudsman's Office. If the Ombudsman is not satisfied with what we've done, the timeliness, the process, the Ombudsman is always able to ask for further information or indeed conduct an investigation of their own accord.
And in your experience, do any of those reports ever result in a matter being referred to the police?
I'm sure there are matters that have been referred to the police.
You're sure, or you know?
I can confirm that for you.
Thank you.
So just before I move on, and on a point asked to you by the Commissioner, you note at paragraph 158 that manual searches have been done for the files that relate to category 1 of those 121 incidents over the past decade. There are 16 category 1 files. That's the most serious sexual abuse.
Correct.
You were able to dig out the files for 15 of the 16.
Yes.
And of them, 13 were reported to police by the Youth Justice Custodial Services. One matter was historic that had been reported directly to police by the victim, at which point the department was informed and completed an incident report. And one matter was not reported to police because it was a professional conduct breach, not a criminal behaviour.
Yes.
And you also say in your statement at paragraph 164 and elsewhere, youth justice workers have obligations under department policy and Victorian law to report child sexual abuse to the police.
Correct. And Councillor Sisting, I know this is that the system is working. We've even had one this week of a report made to one of our youth justice workers about sexual abuse prior to entering, and 3 things happen straight away: safety of the child, health needs for the child, reporting to the police, and it's logged on our system.
Finally, on this topic, I think you referred earlier to on one of your visits to the centre.
Yes.
Do you tell the Royal Commission that that's something that you make a practice of doing, or was that a one-off?
No, I've been 3 times to our centres, and if I could, one of the things when I was in the gallery early the last week or so, I heard repeatedly that children said and staff said they never saw the superintendent. The superintendent was aloof, although I think David Green did dispute that. So I've been with the Director of Secure Services, the equivalent of the Superintendent, and my observations were the following. I went without a lot of announcement. The kids knew who the Director was, called him by name. The second thing, which I did not expect, children would just come up and shake your hand automatically and say hello. I observed children in classrooms at the end of a 3-hour kind of stint, kids who on the files doctors had said couldn't sit still and concentrate, kids dealing with quite difficult things in their classroom about making arguments. What was important was, and I wish this was the case in all of our schools, very clearly on the board what the objective of the day was and what the measures of success for the kids in that classroom were. I thought that was quite positive. And the one incident I might recall at Malmesbury, in the classroom area, one of the young men yelled out to the Director, "I need to speak to you." The Director said, "Sure. What about?" He said, "The food." "What's wrong with the food?" He said, "It's not nutritious enough." Not what I expected him to say. He said, "The food is making me fat." He then, I was introduced to him, he shook my hand, and I asked him how things were going, and he said, "Well, I got a warning from the Director. We have an escalation of warning systems. The highest warning is by the Director. After that's the Youth Parole Board." I said, "What happened?" He said, "I've been mucking up and getting in fights recently, but I'm doing okay." I said, "How was the warning?" He said, "Well, he gave me a warning, but you know what? He told me if I do these things, he'll try and we'll work towards reuniting myself with my 16-month-old son." So here was a setting of a warning, but with a positive element to it, that is to work on his behaviour with something positive, which is for him to be reunited with a son who lives up in northern New South Wales. To me, that was a very positive. It was just a contrast to what we heard over the last fortnight.
One of the survivors commented to me outside the courtroom today that it really resonated with her when she heard our experts say that the expectations for kids in institutions were set so low, and then children work towards those expectations. Do you expect something different in terms of what we can achieve from kids?
Absolutely. And I saw some of these kids are incredibly talented. I saw one young man whose drawings were quite extraordinary. I heard the story of another young man who'd been in for some terrible things, who picked up music for the first time and is now undertaking a course at the conservatory. Now, these are very smart kids who need to be given a chance. And my own view is that, as a parent, I think every child has enormous potential, and the cost is what our system does. I was moved by BGD's evidence. When I think about the cost of the system, she said she'd wanted to be an interpreter because she was good with languages. And now, so many years later, that's unfulfilled. That's the cost of the system. So I think it is the case in every setting. As a society, you set the bar high so that kids can reach for it.
We'll take the mid-morning break now, Ms. Dwyer, 20 minutes.